I found that when you envision where you want to go, it's easier and more likely that you will get to that destination or close to it. So when I was transitioning from my last company, from Zillow to my current company, I pursued car racing for a year or two. And in car racing, one of the things that's really important is that you're always looking where you want to go. So if you're headed into a corner, you shouldn't be looking at the apex. You should be looking well through the corner, right? And the Wayne Gretzky quote is another example of that. Like, you should be skating to where the puck's going to go, not where it is. And I think goals provide that place to look to.
Hey everybody, I'm Blake from Allsmith, and you're watching After the Exit. It's the show where I interview CEOs after they've sold their startup and have them share the lessons that they've learned in blood about business, about relationships, and life. And look, you can learn a couple tips from how they built it, but the real wisdom, the moral of the story, comes at the end, after the exit. Today I'm really excited to introduce you to Austin Allison, former founder and CEO of Dotloop. Austin started selling real estate at the age of 18 and worked in residential and commercial real estate for a decade. In 2008, he founded Dotloop in his hometown of Cincinnati, a company that created software to seamlessly manage real estate transactions. Zillow acquired Dotloop in 2015, and Austin continued to run Dotloop as a Zillow executive until 2018. Austin is now co-founder and CEO of Picaso, which enables people to buy a second home through shared ownership. He lives in Napa, California with his wife, Angela, and dog Paris, and enjoys spending time in his second home in Lake Tahoe, California. This episode is brought to you by Visible.vc. Raise capital, update investors, and engage your team from a single platform. It's also brought to you by JumpDocs.com. Did you know that the average startup spends $30,000 in legal fees in their first 2 years? JumpDocs.com is a legal software that automates the best-in-class documents from formation to fundraising at about a tenth of the price. You fill out 5 questions, and in 4 minutes you can get a Delaware C Corp, stock assignments, IP assignments, employment docs, cap table, ongoing data room, and much, much more. Sign up at jumpdocs.com today. Austin, thanks so much for doing this. I'm really excited to go through all these with you.
Thanks, Blake. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I remember specifically, you and I probably met face-to-face 3 or 4 times in our time that we both were working at Longworth Hall. And I just appreciated I feel like you did a really good job at communicating some of the emotional journey of being a founder at a time that I was very much on the roller coaster. I feel like you were, getting off the roller coaster, or things had kind of quieted down a little bit, or maybe you learned to handle it a little bit better. And so those handful of touch points that we had were actually incredibly helpful to me. And so I've always really appreciated your kind of honesty and maybe empathy that you kind of have. So I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, likewise. It's been great getting to know you, and really excited to share the lessons today.
Great. So what I've done is I kind of, based on what I know about you, and then based on kind of some stuff that I was able to research as well, I've kind of put together 10 topics that we're going to kind of cover, and you can kind of use those as a jump board. And the 10th topic is literally just open-ended. If we fail to communicate something that's really meaningful to you, then you can kind of share that out. So
great.
Cool. With that, let's start off on the first one. I thought the journey I kind of took was toward internal, starting at the personal level, and then working our way out to partners, to other relations, investors, that sort of thing. So we start kind of at the central and move our way out. Yep. So first area, I'm really curious from a productivity standpoint. What are the main lessons that you feel like you've learned as a founder regarding productivity?
So I would say the top lesson comes from a real estate leader by the name of Gary Keller, who runs the largest real estate company in the world called Keller Williams. And Gary wrote a book called The One Thing. And this book, basically, the gist of the book is that there's only one thing that is the most important thing at any given point in time. And it's really hard work to have clarity around what that one thing is, especially as an early stage entrepreneur, because there are so many things that seem like the one thing that are being thrown at you every day. So I've found that to get the most from a productivity perspective out of every single day or every month or every quarter or every year, it's really about doing the hard work to understand what is the most important thing at any given point in time. And then once you understand the most important thing, the next most important thing is being focused on that one thing, right? And it's really hard. I mean, another way that I've heard people talk about this is becoming comfortable saying no. Whether it's somebody who asks to take a meeting with you, or a task that's just been on your list for a long time that you just want to see checked off. I mean, every once in a while, I think it's healthy to check off items on the list that have been there for a while, or to take a phone call or a lunch that maybe isn't the highest priority of that day. I think it's healthy to work some of those things in just to have balance. But in terms of like your high gain time, which really usually happens in the morning for most people, I think it's really important to dedicate that time to the most important thing every single day.
How do you determine it? Or even like on a daily basis now, kind of, is there a process that you use to figure that out? And is that a daily exercise, or weekly, or monthly, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, it's all of the above. I would say that each quarter, at a minimum of each quarter, usually each month, for an early stage company, we're doing this exercise to figure out what is the most important thing for the business. And then from there, each person, including the founder, needs to understand what the most important things are that contribute to the most important thing for the business. And it's just an exercise. It's a discussion, usually when you have a team. It's usually a discussion with your founding team or your executive team around what's most important. I'll give you a recent example. So my current company, which I know we'll talk about later, is called Picaso, and we recently had a COVID compliant, socially distanced executive offsite in Napa. And we were basically debating what our one thing was. And in our case, we're creating a bit of a two-sided marketplace where we need second homes that people can buy, but we also need buyers who want to purchase those second homes. So the question is, which is more important? Is it supply or is it demand? And you can make an argument for either case. You could argue
the marketplace problem, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's the chicken and egg problem. So you need supply to attract demand, but you also need the demand to be able to acquire the supply. But in our case, we went through a long, drawn out, discussion, and we concluded that supply. If we had to pick one thing, we concluded that supply was the most important thing for a variety of reasons. So that made it to the top of our list. And I would say there's a similar exercise that happens every day for me. So I have a combination of, this is a little more tactical, but it's probably worth sharing. I have a combination of tools that I use to help organize my priorities. I have my main tools are, I have a task system, and you could use any task system. I happen to use a software called AnyDo, which is just a really simple, you plug in the task and pick a day. And then I also use Trello. And then the last thing that I use is paper. Okay, so this is my paper for today. So Trello is basically my long-term log of the various things that I'm working on. So like a project or an initiative that carries over week after week, that stays on Trello so that I can track it and move it. And then the task list is more of like a byproduct of what needs to happen to progress the project on the Trello board, right? So let's say, for example, that on the Trello board, it says we need to go get 10 new homes in Napa Valley in the month of January. So I would take that from Trello and I would have a series of tasks that make it to my task list. So one example of a task would be, call the top 10 real estate agents to see if they have any off-market listings. And then from there, what I do is I take the tasks that are on my running list, and every day I go through an exercise, and it usually starts out as a prioritized list with just a couple of items. And then throughout the day, as I'm working on the items, this becomes like my little whiteboard throughout the day. And then I redo that exercise every day. So every day I'm starting with, the most important thing that contributes to the most important thing for the business.
Wow. That's really, and how long have you been doing this?
It has emerged over a period of 10 or 12 years. And I've tried a lot of different things over the years, and it just kind of morphed into the system that works for me. Now, the system that I just shared with you is the system that works for me. It doesn't mean that it's the system that's going to work for everybody. I mean,
Right.
I think it's important that you figure out what system works for you. But doing the exercise is something that everybody should do. And it doesn't have to be like I know a lot of really, really successful people who have really simple systems, like where their system is literally only a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And other people who are much more advanced than I am in terms of the technology and tools. And, what, like another tool that I've seen people use is like a project management software, like one that we've recently used internally at Picaso is called Monday.com.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a bit more advanced. You can go in and create timelines and responsible owners and all that good stuff, add notes to each activity. So wherever you fall on the spectrum, whether it's just a piece of paper or a sophisticated project management software, that's not really the point. The point is that you do the exercise to figure out what the most important thing is that you need to work on every single day.
Yeah. I think that there's so much. I think I heard some quotes recently. Somebody said that startups die from indigestion, not from starvation. And it's that we typically have more opportunities than we have time. And so in truth, like the selecting the one thing that's most important for the organization seems to be the primary role of the CEO or of the leadership team, as opposed to just generating more opportunities. Does that resonate with you, or do you think that's true?
Yeah, it absolutely resonates with me. And that quote is something that our chief product officer shares all the time. So when you said it, it was very familiar for me. But yeah, I think one of the jobs of the CEO is to be crisp about the company's mission and vision and strategies at any given point in time, and to help communicate clearly and consistently with the organization as those things evolve. Because in an early stage company, these things are evolving all the time. I mean, the mission shouldn't be evolving, but nor should the big strategic priorities, more than, once a year. But the activities that are happening to further those goals and the way that we go about furthering those goals, whether it's the products that we're building or the business models that we're implementing, or go-to-market strategies that we're implementing, those things evolve in near real time in a startup. And it can be very abrasive and disruptive for an organization to feel that constant change. And I think part of the CEO's job is making sure that we're communicating so consistently that everybody is in tune with the change, why we're making these changes, how they fit into the broader strategy. So yeah, that definitely resonates with me.
Could you talk briefly on the role of goals in your kind of personal system? Because I know that you're a goal setter.
Yeah, I am a goal setter. I mean, for me, I think for everybody, goals help to clarify the destination that we're working towards, in some sort of usually a finite period of time.
Yeah. But talk about your on the personal side for you, because I feel like you visualize very clearly, or at least in the past, I've seen that you visualize very clearly what you want to do.
Yeah. So that's where I was going to go next. I mean, basically, I think I found that when you envision where you want to go, it's easier and more likely that you will get to that destination or close to it. So when I was transitioning from my last company, from Zillow to my current company, I pursued car racing for a year or two. And in car racing, one of the things that's really important is that you're always looking where you want to go. So if you're headed into a corner, you shouldn't be looking at the apex. You should be looking well through the corner, right? And the Wayne Gretzky quote is another example of that. Like, you should be skating to where the puck's going to go, not where it is. And I think goals provide that place to look to. So for me, I try to visualize them, and I remind myself of them every single day. So one of the rituals that I have every morning, I remind myself and I recite it, usually in my mind, but sometimes out loud, but it's a deliberate thing. I spend 5 minutes every morning as soon as I roll out of bed, reciting the top 3 things that I'm most grateful for and the top 3 goals that I have. And it's always a long-term goal, a near-term goal, and then like a daily goal. So, an example of a classic daily goal for me is to just be as present as possible during the day. The goal can be that simple. Like, I just want to get the most out of today and enjoy every single breath. And then a long-term goal might be, something professional or family related, but I think it's really important to visualize those goals. One story that I like to tell, that's kind of a personal experience, related to goal setting is I'm a runner. And I never used to be a runner. I didn't grow up running in high school or anything. And I didn't really have the runner's build. I was like 70 pounds heavier than I am today. But when I was interning at a real estate company in college, I picked up running part-time with a coworker, kind of fell in love with it. Went and ran a couple of races, and then signed up for a marathon, ran the marathon, and I set goals all along the way and ran the Boston Marathon and a bunch of others. Well, one day, I was watching the Cincinnati Marathon, and I watched the guy go over the finish line, and he finished in like 2 hours and 35 minutes or something. And I watched his eyes as he crossed the line, and somehow I just like connected with that. And I said, if this guy can run a marathon in 2:30s, I can run a marathon in the 2:30s. And for those of you who aren't marathon runners, a marathon in the 2:30s is very fast. It's less than 6 minutes a mile for 26.2 miles. And prior to that, my best time was just under 3 hours. So it's a big, big leap. Like at 2:30, you're basically invited to train for the Olympics. I mean, it's a very aggressive time. But I just saw this guy and I thought to myself, like, if he can do it, I can do it. As long as I put in the work and I believe in myself. And so I basically had this goal that I was going to run a marathon in the 2:30s. I wrote it down on a piece of paper. I posted it on Facebook. And the reason why I did that is I wanted the social accountability. I wanted to tell everybody that I planted this stake in the ground and I wanted them to hold me accountable to that. I went and I hired a coach, a great guy in Northern Kentucky. And we put together a 6-month plan. And I just trained, and this was in the peak of Dotloop in terms of like workload. I mean, I was working 10, 12 hours a day. So that meant that I had to get up at 4 o'clock every morning to train. So I would get up at 4 o'clock every morning. I would train for about 2 hours. Usually I'd run an average of 13 miles per day, basically every day for 6 months. And worked into that was a combination of track days and hill days and all this other stuff. To make a long story short, I ran a marathon in the 2:30s. I finished, it was in Columbus. I finished in 2 hours and 36 minutes, which was 5 minutes and 55 seconds a mile. And I think I was 20th position overall. And the first 15 people were professional runners, like borderline Olympians. So, yeah. And I wasn't like some gifted runner. I mean, that was just like goal setting and obsessive hard work and commitment to the one thing related to my physical personal goal each day. And it happened.
Man, that's incredible. I mean, that's a real accomplishment for sure. I mean, you shaved a minute off every mile in the course of 6 months. That's incredible. Yeah. Man, oh man. Yeah, I feel like I've never met anybody who's as dedicated to goal setting as I've observed with you. And I think that that's a real reason for the success that you have is that one is that you select the goals well, which is kind of the first part. And then two is that you really remind yourself of those. And it's very powerful. Yeah. That's great.
One more thing that I've learned about goal setting is that everybody goals impact different people in different ways. So like what I find to be most energizing is and productive is to set goals that I will most likely not achieve. Interestingly, I set goals that are kind of loftier. So my actual goal was to finish in 2:30. Now, I didn't actually finish in 2:30. I finished in 2:36. But the reason why I like that is because I find that the loftier the goal I set, the more I'm able to achieve. And if I fall a little bit short of the goal, I'm okay with that as long as I, performed at my best. But I've worked with other people who become demotivated by that sort of goal setting, where if you're always missing the goals that you set, it kind of feels like you're not accomplishing anything. So I think it's important to figure, and I've had to adjust my leadership style and my goal setting style internally to ensure that we're setting goals for the organization that we have a chance of hitting, right? Whereas in my own personal life, I never set a goal that I hit. So I think it's important to understand what kind of goals you like to set and where you derive the motivation and feeling of progress and accomplishment, and adjust your goal setting tactics accordingly.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I had that exact same problem in my startup, and people are so demotivated. I'm like, but look at all this progress we made. But people don't necessarily always see it that way. That's good to ask that. Man, that's great. Let's move on to on the technology side. I wasn't sure any lessons you learned about running a technology business, or about how to work with engineers. You're not an engineer yourself, I assume.
Correct.
Yeah. So talk about that a little bit. What lessons did you learn on the around technology and working in technology?
Well, the first lesson is just a broad lesson for life and business, but definitely applied for me in technology, is surround yourself with great people. So I've always surrounded myself with technologists who really knew what they were doing and were super talented and the best at what they do. And I've learned from them. What I've learned from them, I would say that the most interesting thing that I've learned is I've really grown to develop a respect for what engineering is. Like when I first started interacting with engineers, it was always interesting to me how they would like get in this zone, and like our engineers will just code like sometimes all night long. Like in the early days of Dotloop, people would sleep at the office, and it wasn't because we were asking them to sleep at the office. It's because they were just like in this zone on whatever it was that they were building at that time. So I became really curious about that, and I finally understood it, which is like engineering is like, it's like this form of art. You're like building this living, breathing, dynamic thing that's just so intellectually stimulating and rewarding. I mean, you're not only are you trying to build a product that delights users, but you're trying to build it in such a way that it's scalable, and you're collaborating with other engineers who are also checking in code to the code base. And like, it's just this really dynamic, kind of beautiful, artistic thing that engineers do. And I think is when I understood that, it really just gave me a new appreciation and respect for the work that they do. So those would probably be the two biggest learnings. If I had to cite some other learnings related to engineering, it's probably around agility. Like, it's really important that we're building things that are serving the customers in the right way. And in an early, well, in all stage companies, but especially in an early stage company, you're learning these things as you go. So like you start with a certain amount of users and you build a product, and then you get feedback, you find out what's working, what's not, and then you got to iterate on that to attract the next set of users while keeping the existing ones happy. So you have to be very fluid, very agile in the way that you code and in the way that you run the business. So those would probably be the top three.
What do you feel like were some of or is there an early mistake that you made in working with engineers, or an early mistake that you see a lot of founders make?
I would say the early mistake that we made at Dotloop is we originally did not have a product team. So I didn't know that like when we first got into it, we basically just had an engineering team, and it was me and my co-founder, and I was basically the product guy, where I was out talking to customers and then coming back telling the engineers what to build. And then they would figure out how to build it. That was kind of how it worked. But what I've since learned is that there's this whole other team and scope of work that needs to happen around product and design. And it's as important as engineering. So now I'm a very firm believer in having these kind of two separate orgs, product and engineering, not one and the same. And I think of them, I came from a construction background. My dad was a carpenter, and I went to school for construction management. So I've kind of been around that world. And I think the best analog to construction would be a general contractor and an architect. The architect basically designs the house. The general contractor, builds it. And I wouldn't want to build a house with just a general contractor and no architect, right?
Right.
So I think it's the same with product, and nothing against engineers. Like, engineers are very creative and very talented, and oftentimes come up with really great products on their own without having a product team involved. But to do it at scale, I think it's really important to have really strong product and design, as well as really strong engineering. And then the other thing that's related to this is the importance of UX and not just visual design. Like, user experience is everything. And like, we're spending a lot of time on this right now at Picaso, where we've come up with a great product that people love. And once people become Picaso owners, like it works. But it's really, the process is too hard to get people into the door. There's just too much friction. So we're now really focused, like, one of our big strategic priorities in 2021 is removing friction. And so it's really about the user experience. So that's another thing that took me many years to figure out.
Yeah, if you map out the onboarding flow, I feel like for any product, and you say, okay, we start at 100%, and then we move it down to, like, what's the end goal that we want? Like, for you, it'd be co-ownership. And like, if you look at that, typically there's always, if you just map it out in Excel or in Google Sheets, you will see where the break is. There's always a step that will bother you, and you'll be like, okay, that's where it has to be. And then as soon as you fix that, typically the break will move somewhere else. But I found that that's all you have to do for a team, is just put those numbers on the scoreboard, and the work invents itself from there.
Yeah.
That's great. Talk to me from a leadership standpoint. Now moving on to the kind of the third area. What are kind of some, I'd love to hear any stories you have around moments that your leadership was tested. Maybe how about tested and succeeded, and maybe tested and failed as a leader?
Yeah. So the way that I would describe my leadership philosophy is servant leadership. I believe that the leader's job is to serve the people that he or she who basically to serve your direct reports and the other people on their teams. And that's contrary to the traditional view of leadership, which is, in the past, people believed that the employees worked for the leader. And I think now and into the future, I think that great leaders should believe that they work for the people, not the other way around. So that's basically how I think about leadership. My job is to surround the company as it relates to people and leadership. I believe that my job is to surround the company with the best people first, and then second, empower and support those people to do their best work. And if you can do that, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that, especially at scale. But that's the goal. And if you can do that, great things will happen thereafter. In terms of where my leadership has been tested, it has been tested, many times. I would say that the time that's coming to mind for me where it was like originally kind of tested and failed and then tested and recovered is early in the Dotloop days. We basically, we thought we had really strong product market fit, and we then very quickly ramped up. So we went from having like 1 or 2 salespeople to having like 25 salespeople in a period of like 8 weeks. And I'll never forget the board meeting. We were sitting in the board meeting, and our head of sales at the time said, "It's just a numbers game." We were looking at the numbers of the sales that we were doing on a small scale. And he said, "It's just a numbers game. We just need more people to replicate these numbers." And what I learned is that it's not just a numbers game. It's also a culture game and a scale game and a leadership and training game. And we didn't do that. We basically just added 25 people, started replicating the same playbook. We didn't have the right leadership in place at the next level down. We didn't have the right incentives in place. We compromised on, we were basically doing anything to get sales. Like we were giving away iPads for people who would sign up and waiving their first 4 months of payments to get contracts signed. And then what happened 4 months later is all these people who we had signed up didn't really have skin in the game. They weren't really bought into Dotloop as the right solution for them. So it just all completely imploded. And what ended up happening then is like everybody, the culture turned from like amazing to total garbage overnight. Like on the sales team in particular, everybody was unhappy. People weren't succeeding because now all these accounts that we had signed were basically churning out. We had to go through and force churn for more than 50% of our portfolio in like 1 week. And we also had to go basically unwind and lay off most of those people that we had just hired. And, rightfully so, a lot of people took it out on me. There were, in all of our employee comments, there were people, commenting about me and the leaders, and they were making comments about rumors related to things that I would do in my personal life and stuff like that. So basically in that moment, the leadership lesson was, I just owned it, and I was very transparent. And I called an all company meeting, and I had an anonymous Slido thread. And I said, I want to hear, there's nothing that's off limits here. I want to hear all of your complaints. I want to hear all your jabs, whatever it is about me or the company or anybody. I want to hear it transparently and unfiltered. And I'm going to sit here for as long as it takes and address every single question that you have. And you're going to either leave, you may not leave liking the answers, but you're going to at least respect that I addressed all these things as transparently as possible. And that's what we did. And it was like a 3-hour meeting where we just sat through point by point. And it was just, it literally got personal where people were just like attacking me and the other leaders because we led the company in the wrong way. We let the company get to this point where we didn't attract the right people. We didn't empower everybody to succeed. We got sloppy. So I owned it, and it was a painful couple of months. But ultimately what happened on the other side of that is that I learned a lot of lessons about leadership there. And I think earned the respect of the people who remained at the company. And we became stronger on the other side of it as a result.
Wow. Yeah. What was that like leaving that meeting?
I think it felt pretty liberating. It felt like a load had been, on my shoulders. And it just felt liberating to just be transparent. And now that has really influenced it. Another core attribute of my leadership style is I'm very transparent now. And I look for that in all the leaders on our team. We basically communicate everything to our team every Friday. So today at 1:30 Pacific time, every Friday we do an all crew meeting, which is our all hands. And we did this at Dotloop as well. And it was called a weekly FYI meeting is what we called it at Dotloop. And we communicate everything, pretty much nothing other than like personal, we wouldn't share personal HR information with the whole company. But other than that, pretty much everything is fair game. I mean, we talk about company financials, legal things, competitive things, everything. It's an open book. And that I think is really, really valuable. And I saw the same thing at Zillow because I was at Zillow for 4 years after we joined forces with them. And Spencer, who's now my co-founder at Picaso, was longtime CEO and co-founder of Zillow. And he maintained pretty much the same level of transparency up until we left. I mean, Zillow was like 4,000 employees or something when we left. And other than a few things that we couldn't share for public company reasons, everything else was pretty much an open book, wow, even at 4,000 employees. So I think building a culture of transparency is valuable for everybody, and is model leadership in my mind.
That's fantastic. Talk to me about lessons learned about investors. I remember you sharing some of these with me a couple of years ago.
How much time do we have?
Yeah. Think of who you're speaking to. You're speaking to most likely first-time founders who are probably seeking to raise money, or maybe have raised a little bit from friends and family, or looking at angels, institutions. Yeah. I guess what have you learned that you think would be helpful for them?
So there's so many different, first off, there's so many different types of investors. And if you can select the right investors, it just makes life so much better. It makes the process more fun. It increases the probability of your success. So I think the most relevant type of investors to talk about are angel investors. So people who are writing, somewhere between $25,000 and $500,000 checks.
How much money did you raise in angel investment?
We ended up raising $4 million.
In Cincinnati, was that primarily?
Cincinnati. Actually, you know what? It ended up being $6 million, but we raised $4 million as part of a couple of angel tranches. And then that same angel group invested another $2 million or so alongside of a Series A. And on the first $4 million that they invested, they made $52 million in return, to put it in perspective. So they did okay. But it started as a $600,000 round. So I knew absolutely nothing about investing, but I did have a family friend who I always looked up to. I didn't interact with him enough to really call him a true mentor, but I always thought about him as a mentor and certainly somebody that I admired. And that guy was Tony Shipley. Mm-hmm. And my mom worked for Tony Shipley way back for many years, like decades. So I always kind of knew Tony, and very smart guy. And, anytime I would ask for his advice or time, he would give it to me. And but other than Tony, I really didn't know, because Tony had started the Queen City Angels. But other than Tony, I didn't know anything about investing, and or about angel investors. And I didn't really know much about structured angel investing either at the time, other than it was just something that Tony was doing. So what I started doing is just reading books. And I read a bunch of books and found out that you can basically raise money from individuals, and they call these people angels. So then what I started doing is I started finding other people like Tony who had achieved success in their lives, that were willing to share their advice with me. And I would just ask them. I'd just say, hey, would you mind spending 30 minutes with me? And I'd just love to ask you some questions. And I would just ask questions just like this, what does it take? How do you raise money? How do you write a business plan? How do you find a technical co-founder? All these questions that I knew absolutely nothing about, I just started asking people who had been there and done that. And I learned a really interesting and important lesson that I think was probably the most important part that contributed to my professional success. Is I was talking to this individual, also a Cincinnati or Northern Kentucky guy. His name was Norm. Do you remember Norm from Tier 1?
No, I don't think so.
I'm forgetting his last name. He's a great guy. Norm Desmarais, maybe. Sorry, Norm, if I'm mispronouncing your last name. But anyway, he was an amazing guy. Another guy that I just like randomly met. And I was sitting down with Norm one day, and he gave me like an hour of his time. And at the end of the meeting, and he shared all this really wealthy knowledge. And at the end of the meeting, I'm like, Norm, like, I really appreciate all this advice, but I have to ask, like, what's the catch? You're getting nothing in return from me. I have nothing to offer. I'm just a dumb, college kid that's never built a business. Why are you sharing all this great insight with me? And he says, Austin, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that people who have achieved some level of success, most of them are happy to see other people succeed and share their learnings. All you have to do is ask. And I was like, wow, if what he just said is true, like the world is my oyster, because all I have to do is go ask successful people for advice. So Norm told me that, and I went and basically executed that playbook. And everybody I knew who had achieved success, I would ask them for advice, and that would lead from one conversation to the next. And that's how I raised money. So my first angel investor was a guy who's now a great friend and business partner, and an early mentor of mine named Jerry Royce. And Jerry Royce was my boss at Duke Realty. And I basically walked into Jerry's office one day because I was interning at Duke Realty. I said, hey, Jerry, I've been working on this idea, and told him the whole story about how I had been selling real estate and became passionate with trying to make the transaction more efficient. And at the end of my pitch, Jerry looks at me across his desk and he's like, hey, Austin, because I was basically going to not pursue the Dotloop idea because I was so loyal to Jerry and Duke Realty. They had done so much for me and invested in me and through this internship. And I basically wanted to try to find another CEO to go run with the Dotloop idea so that I could stay at Duke as an intern. And Jerry looks at me across the desk and he says, Austin, Duke is always going to be here for you. You have to go pursue this dream. I can see your passion. You may only have one opportunity to go pursue this, and the time is now. Go pursue this dream. And if you want to come back to Duke Realty, I appreciate your loyalty, but if you want to come back to Duke Realty, the door's always open. And he said, and by the way, I'd love to be your first investor. And he had never invested in a startup in his life. He just basically heard my passion, believed in me and the idea, and asked if he could invest. And I said, like, absolutely. Can you also introduce me to some of your friends? So then Jerry set up a meeting with like 3 or 4 of his buddies.
Real fast. That is a great question. Like, that question is so incredible, especially at the moment of someone signing a check. If you just say, who else should get in on this? That is the perfect time to ask that question.
Yeah. And everybody's like people, this is another thing I've learned about investors is there's a bit of there's a crowd mentality here. Like, investors like investing with other people that they know and trust because it helps them to build confidence. But in the angel investor, particularly the non-professional angels, the people who are just doing this for fun on the side, they're not doing it for a living. They're also doing it partially for fun. Like, they like to invest with their friends and talk about it, at happy hours and this and that. So everybody's interests are aligned around kind of investing together, and everybody has a vested interest in seeing the company get funded to a proper level. So Jerry introduced me to a few of his friends. Those guys also wrote checks, and that formed the first $600,000 that we raised. And then we just kind of repeated that process over and over again until eventually, over a couple of years, we had raised $4 million from this group. But I think the main thing to take away from it is, like, as I look back over that experience, most of our angel investors were fantastic. I mean, they basically, all they did is support me, even when things were really low and we were facing challenges. Like Jerry, for example, always there to support me. In the lowest of lows, Jerry would say, how can I help? Hang in there, Austin. How can I help? Versus the investors who didn't approach it like that, they basically brought me down. What's taken so long? You said you were going to generate X in revenue this month and you didn't. What's happening? they'd call me every month or multiple times a month and bitch and moan about different things. And, this time around, I said, no, thanks. Like I'm going to hand pick. And this is one of the benefits of being a second time entrepreneur. You can hand pick your investors. And so this time around, I made sure that all of our investors were like Jerry, people that were there to support, that believed in the team, believed in the mission, regardless of whether or not the company succeeds or fails. Like they know what they're getting into. These things, if you're investing in startups, there's a high probability that the startup will fail. And you have to know that it's partially a numbers game and it's a roller coaster. So I look for investors like that understand the startup game and that believe in the mission, believe in the team, and have the thick enough skin and proper come into it with a proper mindset that they can weather the roller coaster, the ups and downs. And another way to think about it is I'm looking for people that if it becomes a zero, they give me a pat on the back and shake my hand for all the effort and sacrifice that I made or that we made, as a team, trying to make this thing work. So those are the types of investors that I look for.
What advice would you give to someone who maybe has not that type of investor in their cap table? That maybe they took on an investment and now they're getting those calls of what's going on here, once a month. What advice would you give to a first-time entrepreneur who has that situation? Because there's a lot of them, specifically in the Midwest. There's a lot of us. Yeah.
Well, they're everywhere. I wouldn't say that they're just in the Midwest. I think they're everywhere. I mean, startup investing is hard. I mean, I actually don't, and I'm a super high risk guy. Like I race cars, fly planes, and do startups for a living. Like I take a lot of risks, and I pretty much avoid startup investing because it's so risky. Unless I'm personally involved with it, because in that scenario, I'm more betting on like myself and my team. But so it takes a special person. It takes somebody who understands that. So that would be, let me get back to your question. Your question is, what do you do with people who are stuck in this situation now where they have those investors? So
yes.
I think the one thing that I did is I tried to use it as motivation to win. Like I wanted nothing more than to make these investors money, to just, make that pain go away, and to be in the position on the other side of it that I could pick who we would surround the company with the next time around. So that's number one, is just use it as motivation. This is one of the challenges of being a first-time entrepreneur, is you some of these mistakes just happen and you have to tough them out and weather the storm, but use it as motivation. There's no more rewarding thing. As crazy as it sounds, it was pretty daggone rewarding to give, an investor that invested, $150,000 to give that person a $2.5 million check back, even though he was an asshole the whole time. That feels pretty good. So number one is use it as motivation. Number two is don't let it get into your head. Like startups are hard. 90% of these things fail. So even if you fail, you're not a failure, right? You're just pursuing a really hard game, and this is part of the game. And so don't let it get in your head. I mean, if you have an asshole investor, every time they call, just remind yourself that they're an asshole and focus on what really should be waking you up in the morning, which is the mission. If you're passionate about what you're doing, the problem that you're solving, and you believe in it, who cares what anybody else thinks? Just be the best that you can be at following that passion, and however it plays out, good things will follow. So those would be the two pieces of advice.
That was fantastic. That was really good. I'm glad that we talked about that. Talk to me about competition. You guys had some head-to-head competitors at Dotloop. What have you learned about competition through that process?
So I think every startup, particularly startup CEOs and their management teams, definitely need to be aware of competition for sure. For the obvious competitive reasons, but also because you can learn a lot from competition. But I think it's very important to not get too hung up on competition and to make sure that the organization doesn't get caught up on focusing on competition. So I think about it more as, actually there's a new book. I'll use this book that I recently read. So one of my mentors now through this new venture is Howard Schultz of Starbucks. He's our largest angel investor and an amazing guy. And he turned me on to a book called The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek. And in which I highly recommend for everybody watching this video. But in The Infinite Game, they talk about competition as worthy rivals. They reframe these companies from being an enemy to being a worthy rival. And they basically say, if somebody is, like in the old world where you would have called the company competition, in the new world, think about them as somebody that you can learn from. Like they are a worthy rival, which means they're doing at least something differently or better than what you're doing. And you should learn from that. So that's how I think about competition. But I don't obsess over competition in terms of like worrying about competition taking over our business, because I believe that if you are solving a big problem that hasn't been solved at scale, and you're really passionate about that, and you're surrounding yourself and the company with the best possible team, and you're all doing your best possible work, what'll happen with the competition is what'll happen. Like in our case, there's like the concept of co-ownership of second homes is not new. It's been around for decades and decades, and there's lots of companies doing it. Small companies in different resort markets, and so we've got lots of competition depending on how you define it, but I don't think of it that way. I think of it as like, there's a massive market of homes that are sitting vacant, and there's on the supply side, and there's tens of millions of people who aspire to own second homes on the demand side. And no company has figured out how to put that together at scale. That's our opportunity.
That's great. That's really great. Let's move on to partners. Did you guys, I feel like you guys looked at, or I mean, obviously eventually partnered through acquisition with Zillow. Any, kind of succinct lessons that you learned around partnerships, selecting partnerships?
Yeah. The lessons would be that partnerships tend to be very difficult in the early days. It's difficult to get a partnership done in the early days that really moves the needle. And the reason why is because in order for somebody to derive a lot of benefit out of a partnership with like if you're a startup, there's not a lot of value that you can bring to the big partner. So usually as a startup, when you want to partner, you want to try to partner with somebody that can help to accelerate your business. But the question becomes, what do you give them in return? Because partnerships don't really work unless both partners are deriving benefit. So I always found it really hard to figure that out in the early days. And we spent a lot of time on it. Like you can really spin your wheels chasing big partnerships that seem like they're going to be the silver bullet that never end up playing out. So given that experience, and I know there are exceptions to this rule. I do realize that there are exceptions where a small company partners with a big one and it makes the company, and I'll give you one example of that with Dotloop that happened later in the game. But as a general rule, I wouldn't rely on partnerships as a way to like get the flywheel started. Instead, I would think about partnerships as a long-term relationship that you want to start nurturing now. So Zillow, for example, yeah, it would have been great in the early days for Zillow to embrace Dotloop and, give us a bunch of traffic. But that didn't happen. What happened instead is I built relationships with the key people at Zillow. And over a period of 4 or 5 years, they started to kind of fall in love with our company and really like our people. And that ultimately led to an acquisition. Similarly, Keller Williams, this is the one kind of partnership conversation that turned into a big sale for us. We were building relationships with lots of big real estate brands, and nobody had ever done a national deal like this, where a big brand rolled out a productivity software to all of their agents. And the reason why is because all these big brands are set up in such a way that all the agents are very independent. Most of them are independent contractors, usually that are part of a franchisee. So like Remax Corporate doesn't actually employ, as a W-2 employee, the agent in Cincinnati that works for Remax. So because of that structure, it's hard for a big brand to roll out software nationwide. But we started building relationships with all the big brands anyway, and they all ended up, bearing fruit over time. But the first one that produced a lot of value for us was our partnership with Keller Williams Realty, where they ended up deploying Dotloop software nationally. It took several years for this thing to come together and play out, but it really made the business. I'm sure we would have been successful regardless, but I would say that Keller Williams definitely accelerated the rate at which we achieved our mission, of empowering people to work better together. So start these conversations early, but don't expect anything in return in the near term.
Yeah, so you're not trying to close, you're really just trying to actually relate. That probably leads into the next one, which is, what did you learn around the actual sale process of selling a company? That's the aspiration of a lot of founders. So what advice would you give, or what lessons did you learn about selling a company?
The first piece of advice is the one that everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with, which is companies get bought, not sold. And for me, I always viewed selling as a failure. I wanted to take the company public and build a standalone business that could kind of do this on our own and be lasting for generations. And I hope to do that, with our team at Picaso now. But the reason why I mention that and why I think that's important is because we didn't want to be bought. It wasn't like we were going out shopping the company around. But what ended up happening was, because I was out building those relationships, and we were also building relationships with our worthy rivals, like DocuSign, for example. I was friends with, at the time, the CEO and chairman of DocuSign, and many other people on their executive team. So whether it's a worthy rival or kind of somebody who's an obvious strategic fit, I think it's important to start building those relationships. And what happens is, when the synergies start to become obvious for both parties, these conversations just happen. For us, it started out as a business development conversation where we were talking to Zillow about some sort of a partnership. I can't even remember now, but basically a partnership where we would make Dotloop available to Zillow, and we would incorporate, or to Zillow partners, and then we would incorporate some of Zillow products into the Dotloop experience. And then as those conversations progressed, eventually Zillow was kind of like, hey, I really like these guys. And when you hear Spencer tell the story, Spencer would say that he was eyeballing this for years. He was paying attention to us, getting to know the team, getting to know the culture. And then eventually they're like, hey, we really like you guys. We think there could be a really interesting fit. Would you be open to talking about a tighter relationship? And we said, yeah. And then we started the conversation. And the other thing that's helpful with acquisitions is when you're fundraising, it kind of creates an event that drives some urgency, because every time you raise more money, acquirers know that usually makes the company more expensive, because it means that there's more investors that expect a certain amount of return on their investment. So let's say you do a $10 million, let's say you're getting ready to go out and do a $10 million A round, and you have a company that's kind of sniffing around strategic opportunities. You could say to that company, hey, I know you guys have expressed interest in doing something strategic with us. I just wanted to let you know, we're planning to close an A round pretty soon. We're going to raise 10 million. when they hear that, they know that the price of the company just went up by at least 30 million, right? Because any investor that's investing is going to want a minimum of 3x. Most of them want a 10x or more. So that acquirer, if they're interested, they may say, okay, we better look now because it could be a lot more expensive later. So that's one thing. If you're thinking about selling, try to leverage fundraising to start those conversations with the strategics in your network.
That's great. Very helpful. Okay, so now I'd say we've just gone through 7, kind of working from inward outward. Now I kind of want to go more to a little bit more of a meta level. What do you feel like you've learned about personal relationships, whether in your marriage or friendships or with family? What have you learned? What do you feel like your experience with Dotloop has taught you about personal relationships?
I mean, I would say that's an interesting question. I don't. Well, let me just kind of riff for a second. I don't have a really refined answer on this, so I'm going to kind of think out loud.
Sure.
But one is that relationships build over time, and the best relationships get better over time. So I think about my relationship with my wife. We've been together for almost 20 years. We started dating when I was 16 and I'm 35. And it gets better every day. And we've been married for like 13 or 14 of those years. I find the same is true of my professional relationships. Like many of the people who Jerry Royce, who I mentioned, and I've got lots of people like Jerry Royce and Spencer and new mentors like Howard, who I've met within the last year, that these are all relationships that get better with time. And the interesting thing about time is like some of this, now that I'm like maybe 12 years in or so to my professional career, and there's certain things that as I look back that you just can't shortcut. Like now I can pick up the phone and call. I have a network of a bunch of really successful people. And I could just pick up the phone and call these people like right away. Like 12 years ago, I couldn't have just picked up the phone and called Spencer Raskoff, and now he's my business partner. I have lots of examples of relationships like that just build over a long period of time. So that's the main thing, is like, it's a long game. Think about relationships as a lifetime journey, that when you get it right and you invest in them, they just get better with time. So another thing that's coming to mind for me is like focus on quality rather than quantity. In the early days, I used to do, like when I grew up in commercial real estate, they did a lot of these networking events, and we would go to like the whatever business real estate conference, and everybody would sit around the table and shake hands and play golf and all this stuff. And it was like it felt to me like a numbers game. Like everybody was about shaking as many hands as possible. And I think to some extent, because that was a sales oriented industry, I think that's necessary, right? Like, because part of what's happening there is you want to cast a broad enough net to where when somebody wants to go sell a house or a building, there's a higher probability that they'll call you. But in terms of building quality relationships, it's more of a quality over quantity game. So now I don't really go to those events anymore. And I just focus on going deeper with the relationships that I have. And most of the new relationships that I make are like a connection of a connection that I'm already with. So it's much more about quality now. And I would recommend that for everybody who's maybe earlier in their career. Identify the people who you're really connecting with, the people who really believe in you and share a common set of values, and invest in those relationships. Like, try to recognize the Jerry Royce type of investor compared to the asshole type of investor, and invest your time in the Jerry Royce as opposed to the asshole. And if you do that repeatedly over time, you're going to end up 10 or 15 years later, you're going to have a really powerful network. Another thing that's coming to mind for me is I have a good friend, another example of really successful, now great friend in my network named Brad Oberwager. Brad, you would know he's got many companies, but one of his companies that you would know, he created the company called Bear Snacks. So if you go in Starbucks and you see those little dried fruit, like the dried apples or coconut chips called Bear, that's his company. And now it's part of Pepsi. It's sold to Pepsi for like 300 million. But Brad's a really good friend and YPO forum mate of mine. And that's a relationship that I've built over 8 or 9 years now. But Brad's connected to like everybody. And if I ever need an introduction, I can call Brad, and I use them very wisely. Like, I don't abuse this relationship, or I try not to abuse this, but like, if I need a connection to somebody through YPO, which is the Young Presidents Organization, Brad can make it. But Brad will say that introduction that just took me 5 minutes to make took me 25 years to earn. So that's the thing that you have to remember about these introductions, is oftentimes I'll get people, they'll be like, hey, can you introduce me to Spencer? Or can you introduce me to Howard? Or it's like, no, I'm not just going to like spam my network like that. Like that took me 15 or 20 years to earn. And I really respect all the people in my network's time. So think about relationships as a long game. Don't expect to have what takes 10 or 15 years next month. It just doesn't work that way.
That's great. All right. As a kind of a final launching point, I'm curious, any overall lessons around entrepreneurship or life in general, or anything that you feel like we've missed that you're like, I'd be remiss not to share this with founders?
Yep. There's a few things that come to mind.
Great.
I'm going to recite them and then I'll elaborate on them. So follow your passion is number 1. Number 2 is surround yourself with great people. Number 3 would be work super hard. Number 4 would be play the long game. And then number 5 would be enjoy the process or the journey. So just to double click on each of those before we wrap. On the follow your passion piece, there's nothing more important in my mind than following your passion. And this was an insight that was shared with one of my early mentors long before I ever got into business or college. And he said, Austin, whatever it is that you love to do, I don't care if it's mountain biking or snow skiing or real estate, whatever it is, focus on that and work really hard at it. And if you do that, if you apply that formula, success, however you want to define success, will follow. And man, is that true? Like everything I've done in business and in life. And I don't do anything today unless it's something that brings me joy and something that I'm passionate about. So Dotloop started out of a personal passion with real estate. Picaso started as a personal passion related to second homes. Like my flying passion is something that I had dreamed about for a long, long time. Like only focus your time, or try to only concentrate your time around things that you're passionate about, and good stuff will follow. Number 2 is this cliche that surrounding yourself with the best people will elevate your game. Like, man, it could not be more true. You'll hear it over and over and over again. But over time, this is another one of these things that took me, 5, 6, 10 years to truly appreciate. But wow, is it true? When you surround yourself with great people, it's like that is the key. Nobody succeeds alone. Like, I have not achieved success. The only thing that people can associate with me and success is the fact that I've surrounded myself with a bunch of really great people. It started in the early days. It started with great mentors like Jerry, to great co-founders, to great team members, to great investors. And then it just snowballs from there. So like, do not compromise on the people you surround yourself with. Like, that is the name of the game. And that is the product that you're building. Like it applies to life and business, but don't focus first on the team that you're building and the people that you're surrounding yourself with before you focus on whatever product it is you're building, because great people build great products, which create great businesses. So back to figuring out how to get to the one thing. This is a great example of that. It's easy to focus on the product that you want to build. But what you should really be focusing on is the people on your team, and the rest follows. The hard work piece is startups are a freaking grind. I mean, they're an absolute grind. The good news is it gets way easier the second time because you've learned so much, you've elevated your network and your team. It's easier to raise money. So it definitely gets easier the second time, but it's still like so hard. It's just absolutely hard work. And that's why the first point around passion is so important. If you're passionate about what you're doing, it doesn't feel like work. Like I woke up at 5 a.m. today because I had a bunch of stuff going on. I'm back to back all day, without a single 5-minute break. And I had to rolled out of bed with energy at 5 a.m. to get ahead of my day because I didn't have a choice because there's so much stuff going on, but I freaking loved it, right? Like if I was doing something that I didn't love, it wouldn't have been a whole lot of fun. So combination of those two things, hard work and passion, go hand in hand. The long game is that this stuff takes a lot of time and you just have to persevere. When you hit the lows and the failures, you have to keep going. You have to remind yourself constantly that mastery happens over a long period of time, not overnight. You look at all the best athletes, I find are a really good place to look to understand the importance of mastery. I was on a webinar the other day and talking to high school students, and the guy was a racing fan. So we were talking about Formula One drivers, and Lewis Hamilton is arguably one of the best Formula One drivers of all time. And the guy is a master. I mean, he started driving when he was 5 years old, and all he's done his entire life is dedicated his entire life to driving race cars. So whatever, if you want to be the best in your craft, it doesn't just happen with natural skill. That's part of it. It requires some skill, obviously, but it really comes with time and persistence and perseverance. So think about the long game. And then the last piece is about, while you're on this long game, you have to enjoy the process. That is the part. That's why one of my things, usually every day, that goal that I have is to be as present as possible and really enjoy the day, get the most out of every breath. That's what it's about. You don't just want to look back one day and be like, wow, I just finished the race. You want to be at least I want to, every day I want to be like, wow, man, I am on the roller coaster. This is awesome. And I'll leave you with a book that's a great book about life and business. But the first half of it in particular about life, I think, is the best. And it's called Principles by Ray Dalio. For those of you who haven't read that, read that book. It's long, it's deep, but man, it's good and on point. And one of the things he talks about in there is enjoying the process. That's really what it's about. I think he calls it the struggle in the book. It's you have to enjoy the struggle. When you got to wake up at 5 a.m. to grind out whatever it is that you have to grind out that day, enjoy that. Don't dread it, enjoy it. That's all I've got.
That's great, man. This is fantastic. What a collection. Tell me what you're up to now with Picaso.
So we're creating a new category of second home ownership. So Picaso is a service that empowers people to buy a share of a second home and enjoy true ownership benefits, but for way less cost and less hassle. If you go to the website, it's pacaso.com, pronounced and influenced by the artist Pablo Picasso, but spelled differently. Again, pacaso.com. When you go to the website today, you'll see a bunch of super luxury homes. It's still pretty out of reach at our current price point, but it's not going to stay that way. In the very near future, you're going to start to see homes that are more affordable, or accessible rather. We plan to get the share prices down to below $100,000 a share. So think about that $600,000 or $800,000 dream home on whatever lake. We're from Cincinnati, so think Lake Norris. You could get a really sweet home on Lake Norris for $600,000 or $800,000, but that's a lot of money. Imagine being able to buy a share of that for $100,000 or $50,000 down. That's what Picaso does. So It's a really exciting business. Started it with a bunch of my former Dotloop and Zillow colleagues, including my co-founder, who was co-founder and CEO of Zillow, Spencer Raskoff. So it's a really great team. We've got a bunch of really great investors. And yeah, I'm excited about it.
That's great. It's such a no-brainer if you think about these homes that sit idle for such a large chunk of time, to be able to, for more people to enjoy the same home. It makes so much sense.
Yeah, and by the way, for the people who are watching, like until we get, because we're early, we don't have a lot of inventory online yet, which will change pretty quickly. But if you go to the website and you don't see a home that is in your price point or in your market, please do reach out, because we actually have a model where if you find a home that you're interested in buying and you're willing to buy a portion of it, we can help you to buy that home. So like, let's say you found a home in Lake Norris for 400 grand and you'd like to buy 25% of it. Depending on the circumstances, we may be able to help you put that deal together and become a co-owner of that home. So please reach out. All the information is online at Picaso.com.
That's great. Is there anywhere that people can follow you or find out more about you personally?
Yeah, I'm not super active on the social media world because, again, it's not one of those things that I'm real passionate about, so I don't spend a lot of time on it. But you can find me. All of my handles are G, which is my first name, Gregory. So G Austin Allison. So you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And I do a little bit there, but I'm by no means a social media guru.
Cool. Great. Austin, thank you so much. This is excellent. Thank you for sharing your experiences with everybody.
Thanks, Blake.
Hey, I hope you liked that video. If so, maybe watch another right here. Why not? Also, make sure to hit subscribe down below. Thanks for watching.